Well, hey, welcome all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins, a retired Kansas City, Missouri police detective, worked the organized crime unit or the intelligence unit for many years. And now I got a podcast, and we're all about the organized crime, as you guys know, all you regular guys. And for new people, it's all about organized crime, particularly the Italian Mafia in the United States. Now, I have an author here today, Jonathan Dyer. And Jonathan, I really am excited about having you on here because you have a different take about a much cussed and discussed subject or person, Gregory the Grim Reaper Scarpa. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me.
So tell the guys a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background. Where'd you come from other than Marshall? We found out we have similar backgrounds, Marshall, Missouri, rural Missouri, farm life, and Kansas City. And so tell the guys a little bit about yourself.
Well, in 1981, Gary, I joined the Army and spent about a year and a half in Monterey at the Defense Language Institute
Yeah.
learning Russian. After that, went to Goodfellow Air Force Base for some cryptologic training. And then after that, went to the National Security Agency in Fort Meade for some more training. And then shipped overseas to Berlin for 3 years, trying to keep tabs on the Soviet Army during the Cold War. After the Army, I entered law school at UC Davis in California. And after law school, I practiced law for about 10 years as a civil litigator. And then in 1999, I switched careers and became a teacher and taught government and U.S. history and criminal law and retired during the pandemic. And now I live in Central Texas.
Interesting. This is off the subject a little bit, but I've always been curious about that language school. FBI agents go to that, and military people go to it. I have tried to learn Spanish. I'm a pretty good tourist. I've tried to learn French most recently. I haven't been there yet after I've worked on it with Duolingo, the new app to help you learn a language. But it's so hard to learn a foreign language. It is so hard. Do they have some tricks or techniques? I mean, did you really learn to converse in Russian, or were you just like, be able to order pizza or something?
Well, the basic course in the Russian, at least back in the early 1980s, was 47 weeks long. And Gary, they've been at it for a while, so I think they have a pretty good plan. And it's intense. You're in a classroom 6 hours a day, and then you have about 2 or 3 hours of homework at night. So you're not just like I would do now, just kind of dabbling in it a little bit,
Yeah.
hoping that it sticks. And then after that first year, and it's going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back here, but I don't mean to do that. If you do well, you can take another 6 months right away. And at the end of that year and a half, I was certainly conversant in Russian,
Really?
was reading
Wow.
Russian with a good deal of fluency. But I haven't really worked on it since then. So
Yeah.
frankly, mostly disappeared. But I think it's back in there somewhere. And if I needed to
Yeah.
call up on it, I
Yeah.
think I could bring it up.
It would be if you went into a conversation with somebody who was a Russian speaker only. I guarantee you would slip back into it pretty shortly if you went to Russia. Now, was that full immersion? Did you were not allowed to speak English any other time? You weren't with any other English speakers, or were they that rigorous?
No, it wasn't. I mean, particularly in the beginning, there's no way to exist or survive without being able to speak English. And
Okay.
there was the classroom work in that second 6 months that I talked about was entirely in Russian, except for the military portion of it. We had some military um, senior NCOs who were also our instructors, and they would flip back and forth between English and Russian. But our teachers in general were native Russian speakers.
Mhm.
And again, during that last 6 months of the year and a half of training, it was, at least in the classroom, exclusively in Russian.
Yeah. Wow. In order to pick up the nuances, if you're doing it over here or looking at documents or whatever, in order to pick up the nuances of the country, if you will, that's another thing. You really have to know the language well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've heard that indicates fluency is if you understand the sense of humor of a foreign language. And I think I got to that
Yeah.
point.
Oh, well,
And
good. Yeah.
certainly the Russian sense of humor is different from the American sense of humor. But again, not really doing much with it since my discharge from the army. Uh, um, uh, Even that I think is probably difficult to access at this point, to be kind.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I just, sorry to digress, guys, but I just always found this fascinating. Learning a foreign language, I've always found that fascinating as hell. I went to Mexico and I spent 2 weeks living with a family down there, and that's why I asked that question. That was a rule. You were not supposed to speak English, and they were not
Mhm.
supposed to speak English with you, although we had to cheat a little bit, but it was, whew, it's hard, boy, but that full immersion, that'll really amp up your ability to speak.
Yeah, there's a
Uh,
very steep learning curve, and that'll do it.
Jonathan Dyer is the author of 12 books, including 6 on Cold War espionage, a thriller series, The Nick Temple Files, which sounds interesting as hell. So, guys, I'll have a link to his author page on Amazon in order to find some of these other books that he's written. It sounds like you got a little inside track on the espionage thriller genre from what you did for a living, kind of like Ian Fleming and his James Bond series, you know.
Right.
But what we're here today to talk about is organized crime and the mafia. Jonathan wrote a book called Greg Scarpa Legendary Evil. Now, a lot of you guys know Greg Scarpa. Greg Scarpa, there's our man himself, the many faces of mafia killer. And I guess my first question would be, he's been covered quite a little bit, and I was reading your book, and you really have some interesting takes on this guy. But what got you interested in Greg Scarpa?
Well, a writing partner and I were working on some scripts for a possible streaming series, and it, it was about the Brooklyn Mafia during the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And of course, Scarpa was the main character in that
Yeah,
whole drama. And so my writing partner suggested I write a Scarpa biography. And at first, I said, no, thanks. I I've written fiction and I hadn't written a book length piece of nonfiction. In graduate school, law school, you write nonfiction, but it's nothing
yeah.
like this. And he kept pushing, gently, but pushing. And finally, I relented and said, okay, I'll do it. And started researching it. And that's how I got to writing a biography of Scarpa.
What did you find about Scarpa that, why would his story be of interest in 2025?
Yeah, I think the duality of Scarpa's nature, the fact that he was both a mafia good fellow and at times a capo and also an FBI informant is just absolutely fascinating. The way the stories about law enforcement and the mafia sometimes are very they're intertwined as
Yeah,
the as as law enforcement attempts to get a handle on the mafia, and sometimes there's a closeness between them that is fascinating, and that's certainly the case with Scarpa and his 25 out of 30 years, being a top echelon criminal informant for the FBI. So, I think that's fascinating for people, and his personal life is fascinating too.
yeah, it is. It is really fascinating, and there's been so much that's come out about him, and it's amazing. Another thing I found really interesting is I noticed that you looked at this book, Brick Agent, Tony Bolano, who was a FBI agent, who was Scarpa's, maybe it was very first handler. I'm not too sure. He goes pretty far back as a young
Yeah.
man, slipping little tidbits to the FBI. So tell me about that. Uh, what do you remember about how you covered that and his different Bolano's view of Scarpa?
Yeah, I think there was a real challenge there, Gary, because, Villano's book, as I recall, came out in '77,
Yeah,
and my guess was, and I put this in the book, is that his use of aliases for Scarpa was an attempt to try to protect Scarpa, continue to protect him after Villano was no longer in the FBI, and, I think that as a result of that, some of the items that he has attributed to Scarpa, I think, are overblown for dramatic purposes.
Mhm.
So trying to sort that out, and that was very obviously what a lot of this book ended up being, trying to sort out what is out there about Scarpa, what's real, what's not,
Yeah.
what's legend at this point, and that was certainly the case with Villano's book, particularly when Villano was referencing what Scarpa did in Mississippi.
Yeah, I noticed that. It was like he really used 2 different names for 2 different situations down in Mississippi, and a lot of it didn't really align with what we've learned since and what, DeVecchio reported in his book, so which is a whole 'nother story, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it was really interesting.
Yeah, you're right. There are 3 main Mississippi stories that have been attributed to Scarpa and his efforts for the FBI, and, as readers of the book will find out, I my conclusion was there really is no good evidence that he was involved in solving Medgar Evers' murder, and there's reasonably good evidence that he was involved in locating the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers, and also, in 1966, of helping solve the Vernon Dahmer murder.
Interesting, yeah, he had a way of interrogating people when he went down there.
Yeah, enhanced interrogation, I think we call it
Enhanced,
now,
yeah,
right?
enhanced interrogation techniques, oh my god.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time.
Way ahead of his time. You got a sense of humor too, Jonathan, that's a good one. And, yeah, I tell you, when you work with these guys, you better have a sense of humor because some of it's so yeah, black sense of humor because some of the things they do are so horrid, and this guy he was a stone killer, he didn't have an ounce of empathy that I could see in his body when it came to work. But his family was a whole different deal, wasn't it?
Yeah, his family's plural, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
he was married to Connie Forrest, Concetta Faraci, but, anglicized to Connie Forrest, and they had 4 children, the oldest of which was Gregory, who followed his father into the life, and, while he was still married to Connie, he was, shacking up, as we say, with Linda Shiro, who he met when Linda was a teenager, and while he was still married to Connie and shacking up with Linda, he got married again to Lily Dejani, an Israeli, beauty queen contestant, and also apparently a purveyor of diamonds. So he, was technically a bigamist, and what is kind of interesting is in the FBI documents, he drops a little note about how he thinks Joe Colombo is a bigamist, and this was something that, Scarpa himself was guilty of. He's often projecting in those
Interesting.
interviews.
Yeah, it's really interesting. His, personal life, there's one story about the molestation of his daughter, Linda, and I didn't really remember this. I'd not heard this before. What tell us about that.
Yeah, Linda was on her way to high school. She was about 16 years old, and normally she rode with her little brother Joey, and but Joey was not feeling well that day, so the limo driver who would take them to to school every day, um, decided that he was going to try to molest Linda, and so instead of driving to school, he drove to a place in the woods near the school, started to molest her. Linda was obviously shocked, but to her credit, she kept her head and said, "Hey, we don't have to do it like this. Let's meet up later." And he fell for that.
Ah,
He took her to school. She called her mom, said, "You got to pick me up. I just got molested." And you know, molestation is bad enough as it is, but molesting Greg Scarpa's daughter
that
is about as dumb as it gets, right?
yeah. Did
And
that guy
so
did he
eventually,
know who it was? Did he know who that was, or was he just some limo driver they called on the phone and hired a car service?
yeah, I think that, he was part of a car service, and I think
Okay.
that he was generally the driver. She didn't indicate that, "Hey, you're a new driver, who are you?"
Yeah,
Um,
okay.
so, but he was part of a car service, and, so she would have been comfortable seeing him. In fact, when he picked her up, and she told him that Joey wasn't coming along. He said, "Well, why don't you sit up front with me?" And she didn't think anything of it.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, Scarpa's crew gave him what Larry Mazza referred to as just a savage beating, and then eventually, um, his name was Jose Guzman. Eventually, he was killed.
Mhm. Well, that's a guy he did care about his family. He did protect his family. I mean, you could say care about it in a certain way, in a certain mafia don,
Yeah,
the king of his little world way, and what he said goes. And he certainly, uh, I guess, in that world, he brought his son Greg Jr. right into the life. And
yeah.
it was amazing.
I think Gary, without getting too deep in terms of psychological analysis, I
Yeah.
think that his um, his family and his families were also trophies for Scarpa. And so, if you violated something with respect to his families, I think that deep down, Scarpa felt it reflected poorly on him. And so his family just became, at least in my view, another trophy, another thing to say, look what I've done here. But I that's me guessing. But yeah, Greg Scarpa Jr. Followed his father into the life, and fairly early on, when he was about 16, he started being groomed for that.
Wow. And that is interesting that they reflected on him, his family, and there's a
Sure.
story that Vincent the Chin Gigante was talking with John Gotti. I think this maybe was even on a wire or bug or something, and he's talking about Gotti was bragging about how he had his son made, and Gigante said something to the effect of, well, that's too bad. It's
Yeah.
like, that's but to Gotti, that
Interesting.
was a big deal. Hey,
Yeah.
my son, he's made, and he really, best I could tell, he just like made him. He didn't earn anything. He didn't work his way up. He just made him, but that's how it reflected on him. They want this. I guess they want to be this mob dynasty, and everybody wants to have a dynasty, I guess.
Yeah. I came to the conclusion that Greg Jr. really never had a chance.
Yeah,
You probably remember the story if you read it in the book that he came home from a fight in high school and had a pretty good sized lump on his head. And his dad said, "What happened?" And Greg told him, he got in a fight. The guy got a lick in fair and square. Greg Jr. was pretty good with his fists. He did some Golden Gloves boxing and was a fair fighter. And his father said, "Well, you go back there tomorrow and you put that kid in the hospital or don't come home."
sure.
And Greg Jr. tried to talk him out of it, and say, "Look, Dad, it wasn't a big deal. The cops came, they broke it up. It was a fair fight." But his father insisted. And of course, Greg did it. His father meant everything to him, as he has said, and he got expelled. And so, at the age of 16, now what do you do?
Yeah,
You do what
really,
Dad did.
and fast forward from that to the Mary Berry murder. I mean, in that thing, they have this woman who's basically an innocent woman. I mean, maybe she didn't know really enough to snitch on anybody, I don't think, but she knew a little bit or something, and she was, Persico wanted her gone, and Greg Scarpa Jr. was one of the first ones to grab her and make sure that she was taken down while I guess it was his dad killed her. That was just, I mean, talk about cold blooded.
Yeah, just a horrible, horrible story. And my view is that Mary Barry had no idea where Alley Boy Persico was. And Persico's family didn't even know where Alley Boy was, except maybe somewhere in Connecticut. They had, as you know, they had this sort of underground railroad thing going on for mobsters on the lam. I did find an interesting bit about from a U.S. Marshal who asked the FBI if he could speak to Mary Barry, and the FBI's response was, "We have a relationship with her."
Mm,
And so from that, I think it's not unreasonable to conclude that Scarpa may have found out about that relationship. And
yeah.
Scarpa wasn't so much going to revenge on someone for being a rat. I think he was more worried that she might be able to tell the FBI or someone through her, it might get out that Scarpa was an informant. And
Mhm.
yeah, the killing of Mary Barry is just an awful, awful moment. And Gary, even as Peter Lance pointed out, and then I um, quoted guys around Scarpa said, "We're going to hell for this one." So even they felt that this was really beyond the rabbit-proof fence.
What about this story where he supposedly used 666 as a calling card? What's the deal behind that? Did you get
Yeah,
much
I think
into
that
that?
that was back when people had pagers,
Yeah.
and so we're a couple of generations beyond that, but I he would use 666 as a way of saying mission accomplished. So if
Uh,
there was something that he was supposed to be doing, particularly with a hit, then, he would page out to people, whoever's on the other end of these things,
yeah,
666,
666.
and, a bit of, really, dark humor there about, being the devil, and as Peter Lance referred to him, um, in his book, Deal with the Devil, talking about Linda Vecchio, and even, Larry Mazza's grandmother referred to him as the devil, and, uh, so did a federal judge referred to him as the devil, and apparently Scarpa wasn't all that, unhappy with that moniker.
Yeah. I think I read someplace, maybe it was Peter Lance's book, about how he really liked to be called the Grim was it the Grim Reaper? He had another name like that for himself that he'd rather be called. I don't remember what it was now. Yeah, everybody
Yeah, the
knew him
Mad
as
Hatter.
the Mad Hatter, yeah, I mean, he
Yeah.
was just I guess he thought he was Anastasia, the lore of Albert Anastasia lives on through Gregory Scarpa. He had a sense of history, at least.
Yeah, and he certainly had, a clear idea of, self-promotion within those ranks. He knew it didn't hurt his cause at all to be feared by the people around him.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen people do that. They can do that pretty slick in real obtuse ways, so you could never really say, "Well, is that what you mean? What do you mean by that?" But generate that fear out there. You know, he survived a long time and as an informant and was a valuable member. I think it's because he was able to live such a double life. I don't know. What would be your take on that after studying this guy's life? How did he pull that off?
Well, it's interesting, Gary, because there were some people that suspected that he was, talking to law enforcement, and Carlo Gambino in 1972, and this is in the FBI files, said to his men, his crews in the Gambino family, "Stay away from Scarpa, he's got a big mouth." And that was 1972. I think that, one of the ways he was able to, either hide the fact that he was an informant or downplay the whole thing is because he was so vicious, and I think people, would rightly question, would the FBI continue to be in bed with this guy while he's committing murders? And the answer, unfortunately, was yes. And I think that that the way he carried himself and the things that he did made a lot of people just think there's no way. And also, as I point out in the story about Donnie Soma, people that accused Greg of being a rat weren't around long. That they
Yeah.
were, yeah, and so it was a dangerous thing to do, and people around Scarp and around others would warn people of if you're going down that road, it's not a safe road to go down. And so I think that the the possibility of really a very quick execution uh, um, can focus the mind. And I think that's what Scarpa did through his actions that helped him remain an informant for all those years.
Yeah. And the FBI, that's a good point that people in life just, like, they couldn't believe that somebody that was that much of a killer could also be on the payroll or, be with the FBI. I have a friend here in Kansas City who got transferred back from New York, and my last stint in intelligence was in, '92, and he worked organized crime in Kansas City, but he was with the Colombo squad, and he knew DeVecchio. He said he was a nice guy. He said, but, he said he did I'd hear him get on the phone, and he would he kinda talked like a mobster when he would talk to these guys, so, and I understand that you kind of you wanna go to their level. I've done that myself. You kinda go to their level and don't let anything that they may be doing away from you, shock you because then they won't trust you anymore. And you need them to trust you. So, what do you think about that? The FBI, and did that change the way as that started coming out, the way that they dealt with informants, or uh, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think there was an evolution there, from 1962 when the FBI knew virtually nothing about organized crime and about the Italian mafia and how it operated, um, through into the 70s and the 1980s when I mean the stories of the control that organized crime had over New York were just phenomenal, and the amount of control they had over everything, garbage, construction, you name it. And so I think the FBI, who's charged with fighting this criminal threat, I think that they found themselves in a tough position. And at times they had to say, yeah, yeah, I know these are the rules and that looks great on paper, but these are dangerous people. And sometimes we're going to have to go a little deeper. And I also think there's a an aspect of, particularly with Linda Vecchio, and he admits this in his book, that he actually liked Scarpa. He worked with him for a long time. He liked the guy. DeVecchio says, I warned him many times about the line he shouldn't cross, but he's also quite frank about, um, hey, you got to admire the guy. I considered Greg Scarpa my friend. And that's a dangerous position to be in when you're trying to, at the same time, control the life that Scarpa lives in.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, this agent told me that oftentimes DeVecchio, he was single, and DeVecchio would ask him for a key if he could have a key, and he wanted to use his apartment during the day. He said now in retrospect, I figure he was probably meeting Scarpa over there at my apartment because it'd be a safe off the street place to meet.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, although DeVecchio did, and there are a couple of stories where DeVecchio actually went to Scarpa's house in Brooklyn, particularly during the Third Colombo War, and had discussions with them. So, this, uh, Peter Lance's book covers the DeVecchio relationship really thoroughly, and that wasn't really one of the goals that I had here. But of course,
Yeah.
Vecchio plays a big role in half of the book from as he was his handler from 1980 on, and the trial that DeVecchio went through in 2007 till it was dismissed mid-trial, and those items, as far as the detail goes, those really weren't subjects of this book, but they are certainly subjects for people to be wondering about and figuring out how that all turned out.
Yeah, and that whole relationship with his Linda Shiro and Larry Mazza and who we got Larry Mazza out there. Here he is. He was his protege for all those years. Now he's out here doing podcasts, and I don't know what all he's doing exactly. I've been told, oh, you need to get that Larry Mazza on. I've never, I don't know. I don't go out of my way to find mob guys for some reason, but I'll take them if they come. But that
Yeah,
that was
Larry's
such a fascinating
Lar-
relationship.
yeah, very, very unusual. And there's a moment when Mazza thinks that Scarp is going to kill him because he's found out about this relationship he's having with Scarpa's Gumar, Linda Sharo. And the way Scarpa handles that in terms of we've got to keep this secret between ourselves. Otherwise, we're both going to be killed. It's just such a master piece of manipulation to bring Mazza not only closer to him, but really make Mazza dependent upon him for his continued life.
Yeah.
Very, and this is something else I've brought up in a number of different contexts, and that is that Scarpa, who barely finished high school, managed to manipulate a whole building full of college-educated people, very smart and very wise people. He manipulated them for years, and I think it goes to some of Scarpa's what is not book smarts, but innate intelligence.
Right, and, street smarts,
Sure.
just native intelligence, and I've worked with guys like this and know guys like this on the streets that they just like I said, they can barely read a sentence when it comes to reading a book, but they've got that native intelligence, that survival instinct, and able to put things together. And Scarpa must have been a master at that. He must have really been able to see plots and see, connections much beyond what the normal person could see.
Yeah, another good example of that is Carmine Persico. At the end of his trial, the judge said, "You're one of the smartest people that's ever come into this courtroom. It's just
Yeah,
such a shame that this is the path you went down." But federal judge complimenting Carmine Persico like that tells you something. He must have been impressed.
yeah, yeah. I told a guy that once. I said, why don't you give all this car theft stuff up and go do some kind of legitimate business? You're really bright and you could do it. He said, there wouldn't be fun in that. They like that action. I think, is in my opinion, they just like the action. Scarpa's, he was such a cold blooded killer. What are the kind of businesses did he have? Did he have like a whole book of loan shark money out there on the street?
Yeah, he was into what all the fairly standard mafia organized crime um, book of business. You know, loan sharking, running numbers, um, gambling. You know, setting up games, having gambling games, hijacking trucks, particularly hijacking goods from Kennedy Airport, armed robbery, and and Scarpa and his crew and some of the people that were in his orbit were very skilled at burglarizing banks, particularly Joe Brewster, and that was a very lucrative business for them, burglarizing banks back in the day when the a little alarm was about all that was protecting that bank.
Yeah.
So the whole book, Terry, absolutely.
He was, I guess he being a made guy, then he had, I wonder how many associates he had underneath him that were then, he'd set up a deal or he'd help fence stuff and all that kind of thing. He must have had 20 or 30 people underneath him that were out doing scams every day or doing some kind of crime.
Yeah, that's something that I know you understand it, but I think a lot of people don't understand it. Scarpa, for many of those years, was a good fellow. And so his crew were associates, because if member of his crew got his button, they'd be assigned to a capo.
Yeah.
And so, and this is actually why Scarpa became a capo during the Third Colombo War, because when Larry Mazza and Jimmy Del Masto got their buttons, they would have had to assign them to another capo, but the the Scarpa Del Masto Mazza team was such a good killing machine. They said, "Okay, we're going to make Scarpa capo and then assign you guys to him." But anyway, these associates and the numbers can vary, but there are far more associates that are working for the mafia, at least during the time we're talking about, than there were Goodfellas members.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he'd have several people out on the street doing all those sorts of things that we just talked about.
Mhm. Trying to remember, do you have a social club that was kinda like his, where his crew all met? I can't remember now.
Yeah, yeah, the Wimpy Boys Social Club.
No, that's right,
What
okay.
what a ironic name, right? It used to be a gym, and
Yeah,
but these social clubs are all over Brooklyn, and
yeah.
I mean, Carmine Sessa's social club, where Mary Barry was killed, was Sessions, and but anyway, these these clubs were all over Brooklyn, and Scarpa had an office in the back of the Wimpy Boys Social Club, and this is another interesting thing, and I point out right away in the book that Scarpa insisted that his men come to work on time, dressed nicely every day, like a CEO. And he
Uh-huh.
ran a kind of a tight ship. And Larry Mazza one day showed up in, he'd just been at the beach and he showed up in swim trunks, and Scarpa told him to go home and change. And that was the last time Larry did that. But and Larry referred to Scarpa as somewhat of a CEO, a guy who's running a business, and not in a way that most CEOs do, but in the way that was familiar to him in his world.
Yeah, and that's, he was probably more rigorous than some of the rigorous than some of the others, but even here in Kansas City, our boss had certain rules. You kind of dress the same, Sansa belt slacks and a leather coat and polo shirts. They all looked the same, and no facial hair. So, and they were pretty regular going down to the social club. So it's just interesting about the mafia and the structure and how businesslike the really good ones were. The ones that made money, they were really businesslike.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the problem for J. Edgar Hoover in the 1950s. He said there's no such thing as the mafia in the United States. And then when Scarpa became an informant in 1962, he was just spilling his guts on the organization of the mafia. And I think they were just stunned by how organized, how many rules there were, that this was not just the gang that couldn't shoot straight or just some guys with Brooklyn accents beating on people. This was
Yeah.
a highly organized, very deep, very lucrative organization.
And pretty sophisticated. I mean, with the union
Yeah.
union racketeering and those kinds of things, and extortion from the businessmen, especially in New York City. I mean, Kansas City, we had the Teamsters and the skimming from Las Vegas, but in New York City, they had the Concrete Club and all that business. Every building that went up in Manhattan at one time, the mob got a big piece of it in some manner.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you couldn't build in Manhattan without dealing with what you just called the concrete club, which was
Yeah,
the euphemism that became for these guys. They had a stranglehold on that. And if you wanted to build something, you had to deal with these guys. And Giuliani came along and broke a lot of that up by putting the heads of the families using RICO and putting these guys away. But for a while there, as I was saying earlier, these guys were just running New York City, the five families.
yeah.
Well, I counted, I think 8, maybe 9 different times when he told his handler that Carmine Persco was responsible for a murder.
Oh,
And,
really?
yeah, and this is one of the reasons, Gary, that I come out, when people talk about that third Colombo War, they talk about the Vicarina side and then the Persco
Yeah.
loyalists. And I don't see Scarpa as a Persco loyalist. I see him as a Scarpa loyalist, and that he, you
Interesting.
know, he provided information to the FBI that led to the arrest of Joe Colombo Jr. and Joe Colombo Sr.
Oh, really?
And even though he was part of this inner circle of Joe Colombo Sr., he gave the FBI enough information to arrest Joe Colombo. So, yeah, I think Scarpa was instrumental in at least the investigations that Giuliani and the Southern District of New York's U.S. Attorney's Office was conducting. And I found in a Senate report a a quotation that pretty much said that Scarpa was responsible for giving singular information that led to, I think it was over 60 wiretap authorizations and then re-upping those wiretap authorizations. And that language, they didn't put Scarpa's name in the report, but that
Yeah.
language in the report is almost identical to the language that appears in the FBI documents. So that led me to conclude they're talking about Scarpa there. And that was
Yeah.
both Five Star and StarQuest, those two big investigations.
Wow. Well, I was wrong about that, but he was always he was like getting rid of competition and that kind of a thing is what I think of with Greg Scarpa.
Yeah, yeah, he did not um, like competition, and
Yeah.
especially once the drug money started becoming really big in the 1980s, it became dangerous to find yourself in competition with Greg Scarpa Jr. And with Greg Scarpa and the drug dealing in various places in New York.
Yeah. I tell you that guy, he operated under his own set of rules, didn't he? He did not operate under other people's sets of rules. Didn't appear to be like.
Yeah, yeah, he did, but these were rules that weren't exclusively his. He was operating under the mafia's rules, and for them, it was this idea of territory was really important. This idea of who's going to get the cash, the money that flows from these kind of activities. And as you know, Gary, for a long time, the mafia was taking the position that you can't be involved in drugs, can't be involved in
Yeah.
drugs, narcotics, can't be involved in prostitution. But the money was so lucrative, starting in the late 1970s, that eventually those warnings just fell on deaf ears.
Okay. Yeah. It was don't ask, don't tell, wasn't it? After a while, the money got big enough.
Yeah, it's one of those things that the um, these absolute rules of the mafia. Scarpa broke every one of them. He the number one being loyalty on penalty of death,
Yeah.
and he was pretty early in his career. He'd been a button man for about 10 years when he broke that oath, and of course, just about everything else he did, every oath he ever took, he broke, and that includes whatever these rules were in the mafia were very convenient for him when he wanted to use them, and he ignored them when he didn't.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Jonathan Dyer, this has been great. The name of the book is, let's put that book back up there, is, sometimes my mind goes blank. Jonathan, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? There we go. Many, uh, Legendary Evil, The Many Faces of a Mafia Killer. Jonathan, I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Gary, thanks for having me. It's been fun talking to you and talking a little bit about Kansas City and Missouri too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
All right, thank you, sir. Bye bye.
Bye. Don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles, so when you're out on the streets there in your big F-150, watch out for those little motorcycles when you're out. If you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, be sure and go to the VA website. They'll help with your drugs and alcohol problem if you got that problem, or gambling. If not, you can go to Anthony Ruggiano. He's a counselor down in Florida. He's got a hotline on his website. If you got a problem with gambling, most states will have, if you have gambling, most states will have a hotline number to call. Just have to search around for it. I've always got stuff to sell. I got my books, I got my movies. They're all on Amazon. Just go and I got links down below in the show notes, and just go to my Amazon sales page, and you can figure out what to do. I really appreciate y'all tuning in, and we'll keep coming back and doing this. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.